and to see so many friends already on the among you. So and apparently is happy to see you all too. My cat. In some ways, on the one hand, I'm very happy to be able to be with you in part just to show solidarity with the struggles at Boğaziçi, and at the same time, I feel inadequate because I don't have anything to contribute. In fact, I'd like to hear from you about questions at Boğaziçi. What I have prepared is really about theoretical questions that I'm working on that I'm hoping, in fact, you could help me with. The other way I feel inadequate also is that I feel like on days like today, we ought to be discussing the situation in Palestine. I don't have anything particularly intellectually satisfying or politically satisfying to say about it, I must admit, so I don't have a presentation about that. But in the discussion, both, I guess I'm partly pointing to the fact that you, in many ways, about these things have more to say than I am in the discussion. I'd be very happy if you just ignore what I've just said and we talk just about Palestine or just about the situation at Boğaziçi. Okay, but I'll try by saying something I know. We'll start with that. I'll try about 20 minutes, and I'm hoping that that could present the basis for things. It's what I wanted to present, and because it's something recurring that I've been thinking and even saying recently, trying to think a politics of multiplicity, which in some ways I think of, and this might take some explanation, as the thinking the prerequisites for communism. But communism, of course, thought differently, which I'll get to in a minute. I see it as when the work that I've done with Antonio Negri, maybe starting an empire, one thing I think was successful is developing a political project in terms of a theory of multiplicity, or maybe in terms of a theory of two multiplicities. I guess every politics of multiplicity, I think, has to be double. On the one hand, and in that project, we're thinking about empire as a multiplicity on the one hand, and multitude as another. I mean, the structure of multiple structures of power that are together articulated on the one hand, and a multiplicity of forces of revolution and resistance, and thinking those together. Like I say, I felt like that was relatively successful political project at the time. It was rewarding for me in terms of a relationship to theories of multiplicity that had fascinated me then, and I guess still do, in the work of Michel Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari. So that in the sense we were in relationship to Foucault's notions of dispositif and diagram, even the notion of a constellation of resistances, which Foucault talks about. All of these I'm thinking of as theories of multiplicity. With Deleuze and Guattari, the notion of agencement, translated usually as assemblage, abstract machine, plane of consistency. For those of you in these areas, you can recognize the constellation of concepts in which we're working. But I think it needs to develop, and I this is what I'm trying to do, and what I'm hoping you can help me with. Tony and I recently have done this in an essay in terms of what we're talking about, a concept of class prime, which I guess I don't feel I need to get into today. What we're really thinking about there is a way of understanding a constellation or multitudinous notion of class. Some way that the notion of multitude could function as a form of counterpower, as an organized organized resistance. And what we really hadn't done, I mean, this is what class prime is aimed to do, and the kind of things I want to get into today, is thinking of it more than a multiplicity of the forms of labor. In other words, more than a notion of the working class as multiple, but rather a notion of class that's composed equally of struggles against capital, of struggles against hetero-patriarchy, of struggles against white supremacy and other racial formations, coloniality, and so forth. And that's what I meant really by a notion of communism. And this would be a communism, well beyond what Marx would think, a notion of communism that is not only the supersession of capitalist relations of production, but also the supersession of patriarchal social relations and of racial relations, etc. That's maybe an expanded notion of communism, or anyway. So what I think we need to do, like I keep saying, this is the task I'm thinking that you in discussion could help with, that's just in process really, is one, to expand our notion of multiplicity in order to, as I just said, account for and engage multiple structures of power and organizational liberation in terms of class, race, gender, sexuality, coloniality, etc. In other words, maybe put empire, this is what I'm really trying to do, put empire in dialogue with other theories of multiplicity of power, roughly characterized as a certain strain of intersectional politics. The second thing that I think we need to do, and this is maybe what I'll do most here, is develop a concept of articulation that's adequate to the mode and logic of relation among these elements of a multiplicity. How do the different structures, put in simple terms that all of you have engaged with, what is relationship? How is patriarchy and capital and racial hierarchies, how are they articulated together? What's the logic and mode of their relation? So that's the second one, develop this concept of articulation. And then third, to confront the political problem of the relationship among or between these two multiplicities. In other words, in what sense does our analysis of the relations among the structures of power, that multiplicity of the forms of power, in what sense does that suggest or even dictate the organization of the struggles of liberation? That's something I'll come back to at the end. I mean, in some ways, that's the only real question, the explicit question I have. So here, let me go, this now, what I've prepared now is a kind of me going back to research that, and maybe these are things that'll seem very familiar to you, which would be great. What I wanted to work through a little bit is the way this has functioned. I'm thinking of writings in the early 1980s, really, about racial capitalism and capitalist patriarchy. I'm thinking about these authors as kind of building blocks on which I would understand how to both pose the relationship among the structures of power and understand this notion of articulation. So in specific, one of the things I want to start with is an essay by Stuart Hall, published in 1980, in which Stuart Hall is analyzing the relationship between race and capital in South Africa. So he's looking at how to understand, and he's reading South African author Marxists on this, how to understand that relationship between the structures of racial domination under apartheid and the structures of capitalist domination. And he's doing it through a innovative reading of Louis Althusser's concept of articulation that Althusser developed in Reading Capital. And when I look back and reread Reading Capital, I know at least some of you are expert Althusserians. It's amazing how the concept of articulation functions through the whole. All of the seminar must have been full of that discussion of articulation. Anyway, so what Hall's doing here, when he says that race and capital are articulated, he means that neither one is autonomous. In other words, capital can't function without racial hierarchies, at least in the South African context. I would say even more in general. And the other is that the one does not derive from the other or hold supremacy over the other. In part, he does this through a discussion about structure and superstructure, as if capitalist relations were purely structural and racial relations were superstructural, that there's no, that racial hierarchy does not derive from capitalist relations. So instead, race and capital are at once relatively autonomous and mutually constitutive, that they're on equal footing, you could say, that capital and race are equal in some sense, distinct and yet inseparable. And so this articulation here is functioning as a non-dialectical mode of relation. I mean, I think that, here's my way of saying this is not Althusser or Stuart Hall really, is opposing a notion of mediation. I think the notion of mediation, I don't know if this is, I'm saying this too briefly, that the notion of mediation is always in some sense dialectical, that the mediating point always suggests the possibility of a subsumption in unity. and hence that the many always can be subsumed in the one. Here's a political example of that, just to give you a touchstone that I assume would be familiar. In a previous era, certainly in the 1960s, up to the 1960s, there was a notion in many communist and socialist parties that, of course, there was a plurality of structures of power. They each had a section on the woman question, or they had a section on the race question, et cetera. But the idea was, despite or in relation to this plurality, it was always class that served a mediatory role and was able to subsume these other structures of power within it, or that in some sense they derived from it. This is what I mean by mediation. Whereas I'm reading articulation functioning instead as each of these structures of power is relatively autonomous, that they're roughly equal, and yet they are inseparable. So inseparable and mutually constitutive. Hall develops one other aspect of the concept of articulation that I find really important, or interesting, or even difficult to work through. Again, creatively rereading Althusser, and if some of you are interested in going back to the Althusser part of that, I'd love to. So the second characteristic then of articulation, he says, although race and class are in principle on equal footing, in a specific conjuncture, one structure can, or maybe always, plays a dominant role. This was the Althusser formulation of a structure in dominance. But what it means here practically, I think, is quite easily understandable. Hall says, think about plantation slavery and agricultural production in the Americas. And in that, there's, of course, a articulation between race and class in the plantation slavery. But race is the structure in dominance. In some ways, in that specific conjuncture, race has a predominant role over capital in their articulation. Whereas after emancipation from slavery in the United States, he says, race and class, or race and labor, race and capital are always articulated. But in that situation, capital is the structure of dominance over race. So that here we have this. I'm talking. I'm not sure if they're too simple or too difficult terms, but here, the ones that are interesting me is this notion of articulation has this dual levels. On the one hand, and both of them are rather difficult, it seems. The structures of domination are each equal, relatively autonomous. That's the term. They're each relatively autonomous, and yet they are mutually constituted in such a way that they cannot exist without each other. That's on the one hand. And the second hand, in a specific conjuncture, in a specific temporal national conjuncture, one can have a role of dominance over the other. Let me do this same thing in terms of capitalist patriarchy, because then, I think that you can see the way that the two, and here I'm thinking specifically of an essay that was classic in the US context of socialist feminism and much commented on by Heidi Hartman, called The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism. So here too, I just want to show how parallel it is to Hall's thinking, although she, and in this whole theory discussion, they were not using the term articulation, but I think it fits perfectly. So here, let me just run through the same things so that you can see it from a different angle. Here, the notion is, implicit in the notion of capitalist patriarchy itself, is that capital and patriarchy are each relatively autonomous. They're on equal footing. It's not like patriarchy is a product of capital, or vice versa. They're on structures of power on equal footing, and yet they're inextricably tied and mutually constitutive. The capital can't function without patriarchy, and vice versa, patriarchy can't function without capital. The way they've developed in this historical mode, whether they could in the abstract in another world, I don't really know. So the second part is then this conjunctural analysis, that in a specific conjuncture, there's specific relation of dominance of one over the other. And so the examples that Hartman gives in this essay, The Unhappy Marriage, is first the family wage. The family wage is a articulation of capital and patriarchy. But she says that it's one in which patriarchy has a position of dominance with regard to capital. That in some ways, the dictations of the terms of what the family wage constructs, the ways that unwaged female labor in the home is dependent on male labor, et cetera, is one in which patriarchy plays a role of dominance. In contrast, she gives the example of the status of children, or the status of the belonging of children. And what she's pointing to is that historically, when children are productive, they are thought to be the property of the father, whereas in a different historical conjuncture, when children are unproductive, then they're thought to be the property of the mother. This shift between who, and that here she's saying capital is the structure and dominance over patriarchy in this relation. So all I wanted to just get is, maybe elaborating and fleshing out this notion of articulation and how it functions in each. Obviously, the next step would have to be one that goes beyond the two relations here. You know, that that one would have to think an entire multiplicity of structures of power, all relatively autonomous and on equal footing, and yet inextricably tied and mutually constitutive. Yeah, okay. So so that you would think heteropatriarchy, coloniality, race, racial hierarchy, capital, each of these relatively autonomous on equal footing. And this is what I said, I'm not saying anything particularly original here. One strain of intersectional analysis, I think, works through this, and I'm trying to get it, in a way that the notion of multiplicity that Tony and I have developed could interact, move together with these. I should use the word articulation. Okay, so that's the first point, conceptual point. Multiple structures of domination that are relatively autonomous and yet mutually constitutive. And the other is that in a specific conjuncture, there's a structure of dominance potentially of one over the other. I would say, and so here I can get to the final part and even just a problem about it, or difficulty for me. I would say that in the US today, and this might be true in the central dominant European countries, that race plays a structure in dominance with respect to other structures of power or structures of domination today. That's what I perceive in the US, or that would be a proposition, just a way of saying that. I would say, and similarly, and I don't know if this is familiar to some of you, that in Latin America today, I'm thinking specifically of Argentina and an excellent recent book by Veronica Gago, that in Latin America today, gendered violence and gender domination plays a role in the structure of dominance with respect to others. And that one can see both of these in the struggles, that in some ways today, it is struggles against white supremacy in the US, the Black Lives Matter struggles, for instance, that play a role of dominance in their organizational capacities. And similarly in Latin America, I mean, this is what the various assemblies and women's strikes and movements around abortion, et cetera, in Argentina or in Latin America today also organize within themselves the multiplicity of other struggles. That's what I wanted to get to it. So it seems to me here's two problems about this. And I'm going to end with these problems, really. I'm hoping that could be something to hold on to. One is a simple conceptual error that maybe seems to me to happen too often, which is that it's a mistaking of temporality or levels, really, which is to read the conjunctural relation of dominance as if it were general or in absolute terms. Like, for instance, I think that this happens in the US today, or at least one could imagine it, which is to say that the conjunctural dominance of race implies a general priority of race over gender domination, capitalist domination, et cetera. That's, like I say, one way to say it in my own terminology I get earlier is that articulation falls back into mediation. That rather than being able to think these as relatively autonomous structures of power, one confuses the contemporary or specific structure and dominance for something in principle. Okay, maybe that's clear enough for it. The second here is not an error, really. It's a conundrum for me, or a real conceptual organizational problem. And the question goes like this: what is or should be the relationship between the multiplicity of structures of power and the multiplicity of struggles for liberation. Like, and really, this is, maybe I'm thinking this even more clearly now, which is that should the multiplicity of struggles of liberation point toward the, how would you call it, the general frame of the structure of the relations of power, the one in which each is on equal footing and relatively autonomous, or should the organization of struggles regard the structure and dominance of a specific conjuncture? Okay, I know I said that in super confusing terms, so let me give you the actual examples. In an earlier era, like I said before, this often functioned with respect to the centrality of the industrial working class. And so the assumption was, and I'm posing this as a way of, almost disqualifying this position, I hope, at least in my own mind, which is that, because I think it's something we've struggled against for decades, which is the notion that the industrial working class was central in the relations of capitalist production, and therefore should be central in a leadership role in the struggles for liberation. That this is something, that sort of like I said before, that yes, there's a question of racial hierarchy. Yes, there's a question of patriarchy and gender hierarchy, but the assumption was that they should function in a subordinate way to the primary struggle or primary contradiction, whichever we want to say it, of the industrial working class, because of its centrality in the current conjuncture of power. That was the thing. So I wonder how much. So here, see if this. Here's a not completely thought out, but real problem, it seems to me. In the contemporary, this is my perception of the contemporary, last 2 years, since the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter movements in the US, about which I'm sure you know quite a bit. So I can take for granted a certain amount, but it seems to me, one of the things that's been very exciting in the struggles is the way that in all of the Black Lives struggles, other structures of domination are brought in always together. Like every Black Lives Matter demonstration always involves anti-capitalist discussion, always involves the affirmation of Black trans lives. It always is anti-patriarchal and feminist, etc. So that there is this plurality or multiplicity that I'm talking about. But it does seem to me that that race takes priority in the organization, and in some sense subsumes the other struggles. In my language before, that articulation falls back into mediation, and rather that the conjunctural dominance of racial structures of power in the present US, the conjunctural predominance of one structure of power seems to necessitate this predominance within organization of anti-racist struggle. My view is that mode of organization has to be resisted. But here, this is like I'm posing it as a question for you, rather than really me having that much of a well worked out position about it. It seems to me, and maybe this is true of our concept of multitude, from the beginning. So if I can go back to that one has to insist on the multiplicity as a principle of organization. Multiplicity here, that can't be reduced to any unified structure. I mean, with one element holding predominance over the others. I don't know if these will make sense to you. It has to do, it's terminology not only with a Marxist tradition, but a specifically Italian Marxist tradition that poses this as, it's analogous to the problem they often posed, which they called the relationship between the technical and the political composition of the proletariat. And what they meant by that is that the organizations of capitalist production, what is the relationship between that and the organization of revolutionary workers organization. So does the technical composition say that industrial workers are directly engaged with capital, whereas unwaged domestic workers in the home are not directly involved? Does that imply, to what extent does that imply what the political organization should be? And so I'm thinking, I'm posing in some ways the same question with regard to this in this intersectional framework. Like, to what extent does the predominance of one structure of power in a specific conjuncture dictate or imply or make necessary the predominance of one form of struggle in the organization of resistance or revolution? I mean, it seems like a real question to me. I hope it makes sense. And in fact, I'm inclined to stop here. Maybe I should just say, if it's been confusing because I'm presenting to you, I wouldn't even call this work in progress. These are concepts I'm trying to work out. And the project really, as I said at the beginning, which I hope you understand easily enough, which is that I think Tony and I have been very good at thinking the concept of multiplicity, but we've not been, or this is not the way the project began. Even if race questions and questions about feminist and analyses were important to us, we weren't able to think at that time, 20, 30 years ago, the articulation of these different structures of power, and hence the notions of resistance. So this is an attempt to try to merge different notions of multiplicity that I think have been working over the last 20 years. And then from that to pose what I consider real political problems. I mean, especially this one's about the forms of organization and struggle today. I hope that makes enough sense, or could serve as some discussion that you could relate to. Yeah, maybe let me stop and see if it makes sense for me to explain more, or if we could go in different directions. Yeah, like I said earlier, this is what I'm also inviting. I know it's useful for the guest to say something to start, and that's what I try to do. But I'm perfectly happy if we go in a completely different direction. And the two I was offering is, you teach me about Boğaziçi, or talking about Palestine, which are two, and you could maybe relate them. Anyway, you guys go at this point. Tell me where we're going to go.